cos rule to you, and why sine, cos, and tan are positive and negative in their respective quadrants. Let's look at our prior knowledge. Our prior knowledge tells us that x is positive here and x is negative there. Y is positive there and y is negative here. And when we determine our sine and cos ratios, we look at our respective triangles. So in this triangle, I can see that if I work from this angle, that sine is y over r, cos is x over r, and tan is y over x. Now that's pre-knowledge. Now let's have a look and see what is positive in our first quadrant. Now if I look at my ratio sine, I know that sine is y over r. And in my first quadrant, I can see that y is positive. Why? Because this side of my Cartesian plane, the y values are positive. So that's good. I can also see that r is positive because r is always positive. So if I take the signs in front of the y and in front of the r, I can see it's positive and a positive. And a positive divided by a positive gives me a positive. Therefore, sine is positive in the first quadrant. Let's look at cos. Cos is x over r. And I can see that x is positive. I can see r is positive. So therefore, a positive divided by a positive, again, that also gives me a positive. Therefore, cos is positive in the first quadrant. Next, let's look at tan. Tan is y divided by x. And if I look at my first quadrant, I see y is positive and x is positive. Therefore, a positive divided by a positive also gives me a positive. And therefore, we conclude by saying all our ratios is positive in our first quadrant. I hope that is clear. All right. Next, let's look at our second quadrant, learners. Okay. Our second quadrant, I see that only x is now negative. Y is still positive because it's still part of that positive side of y, and r always remains positive. So let's look at sine in my second quadrant. Sine is y over r. Y over r, y is positive, r is positive, therefore a positive divided by positive is going to give me a positive. Okay. Let's look at cos. X is negative, r is positive. So a negative divided by a positive is going to give me a negative. Therefore, cos is negative in my second quadrant. Let's look at tan. Tan is y over x. X is negative in the second quadrant. Therefore, a positive divided by a negative will give me a negative. And therefore, we conclude by saying that sine is positive in my second quadrant. Let's go to our third quadrant. I see that if I look at sine y over r, so it's negative y over positive r, and a negative divided by a positive gives me a negative. Therefore, sine is negative in the third quadrant. Let's look at cos. X is negative, r is positive. A negative divided by a positive, because of my ratio, that's also going to be negative. Okay, let's look at the tan function. It's y over x. I have negative y and I have negative x. So if that's negative y and there's negative x, a negative divided by a negative gives me a positive. Therefore, tan is positive in the third quadrant. Therefore, we say t, which relates to t, tan, that's positive. Alright, so far so good. Let's look at the last quadrant. Here we have y negative. So let's see. Let's look at sine. So sine is y over r. So it's y over r. So it's a negative divided by a positive. And that gives me a negative. Therefore, sine is negative in the fourth quadrant. Let's look at the cos, x over r. X is positive, r is positive. Therefore, cos is positive in the fourth quadrant. And let's look at tan. Tan is minus y over x. So negative divided by a positive is a negative. Therefore, only cos is positive in my fourth quadrant. So hence the acronym ASTC, and usually what we say is all stations to Cape Town, that you can use as a reminder to memorize the quadrants and also where it's positive and negative. And then, learners, let's look at why it's called the cos rule, because in the fourth quadrant, cos is positive, so we place our C there. In my first quadrant, all is positive, sine, cos, and tan, so we place the A there. And in my second quadrant, let's look at our second quadrant, I can see only sine is positive, we place the S there. And then the last one, learners, the third quadrant, we see that tan is positive, so we place the T there, and then learners, we call this the cast rule. That's why it's called the cast rule.